There's one week in history unlike any other. During this week, time itself was split in two. The exact moment when the clock stopped. Everything that came before pointed to this moment, and everything that came after was forever changed. Over these 7 days, the ultimate battle was fought between life and death, between darkness and light. 7 days that changed the destiny of humanity. Yet what unfolded then wasn't understood as it happened. No one grasped what was truly taking place, not even those standing just a few yards away. They thought they were witnessing a brutal tragedy, unaware that it was, in truth, the greatest victory in history, the fulfillment of God's plan, written from the dawn of time. This was the week the circle closed, and everything that unfolded on this earth over 2,000 years ago was precisely designed for one single purpose: our redemption. Every step, every betrayal, every drop of blood was part of a flawless design traced from the very beginning. Stay until the end, because only when you fit every piece of this puzzle together will you understand why this week still carries the most powerful message in the universe. For 3 years, Jesus traveled through dozens of towns, shattering every limit of what seemed possible. His power was undeniable. He healed the sick, set the oppressed free, and performed miracles no one had ever witnessed. But Jesus didn't just heal incurable diseases. He demonstrated something far more astonishing. He had absolute control over death itself. His name echoed throughout the region like an unstoppable wave. People crowded at doorways, and multitudes began following Jesus wherever he went. The sick, the oppressed, those who had lost everything came to him, carrying their desperation. And then the moment came. The hour had arrived. The map of his life now pointed to one place. So, when the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. The countdown had begun, and he had to arrive on time to deliver a crucial message. The journey was long. He went through the villages of Samaria and the region of Perea, across the Jordan River, teaching about the kingdom of God and preparing his followers for what lay ahead. When they finally reached Jerusalem in time for the Feast of Tabernacles, Jesus went straight to the temple and began to teach. The tension with the religious leaders was thick enough to cut with a knife. In the midst of the debate, Jesus threw down a challenge. "Truly, truly, I tell you, whoever keeps my word will never see death." The Pharisees mocked him. "Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? You're not even 50 years old, and you say you've seen Abraham?" Then Jesus fixed his gaze on them and spoke the words that sealed his fate. "Before Abraham was, I am." The shock was absolute. I am was the sacred name of God, revealed to Moses at the burning bush. Jesus wasn't just saying he existed before Abraham, he was claiming to be God. For them, that was the limit, an intolerable blasphemy. They scooped up stones to kill him on the spot, but Jesus slipped through the crowd and disappeared from the temple. His hour had not yet come. He slipped away to Bethany, to the home of his friends Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. He needed time, but time was exactly what he didn't have. When things calmed down, Jesus returned to Jerusalem, and there he healed a blind man at the pool of Siloam, a place you can still visit today. But this fresh display of power only fanned the flames. During the Feast of Dedication, what we now call Hanukkah, the religious leaders cornered him in the temple. They demanded a straight answer. "Are you the Messiah, the saving king we're waiting for? Tell us plainly." Again, Jesus left them speechless. He said, "I and the Father are one." Those were the words, the definitive claim. Once again, Jesus got the same reaction. They reached for stones again, ready to execute him for blasphemy. And for the second time, Jesus slipped away, this time fleeing to the region of Perea. There he received terrible news. His friend Lazarus was gravely ill in Bethany. But Jesus didn't go to save him. He waited 2 full days. His disciples couldn't understand it. When they finally arrived in Bethany, Lazarus had been dead and buried for 4 days. Then Jesus did something that would have nearly the whole nation hailing him as king. The greatest public miracle of his life was about to unfold. Martha, heartbroken, said to him, "Lord, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." Then Jesus looked at her and said, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, even if he dies, will live." And standing before the tomb, his voice rolling with divine authority, he cried out, "Lazarus, come out." And suddenly the man who had been dead walked out of the grave. It was the most public, most defiant miracle of all. There was no turning back now. The news spread like wildfire. All Jerusalem was talking about Lazarus's resurrection. For the religious leaders, this was the last straw. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council, called an emergency meeting. They were terrified. Caiaphas, the high priest, argued that Jesus had to die because if everyone followed him, the Roman emperor would see a revolt and destroy the nation. But that wasn't the truth. They were jealous, envious that the crowds were following him and not them. They voted, and the decision was unanimous. Jesus had to be executed. From that day on, they officially plotted his death. The end was drawing near, and Jesus knew it. The time had come to fulfill the purpose for which he was born, to die. After preaching in Perea and Jericho, he returned to Bethany. There, 2 weeks before his death, Mary anointed his feet with an exquisitely costly perfume. "For my burial," Jesus whispered. She was the only one who understood. The exact moment had arrived. Passover. The final week of his life was a masterpiece of provocation. It began with the triumphal entry. Jesus headed for Jerusalem, and word that the man who had raised someone from the dead was so close to the city drew a vast crowd. Then Jesus mounted a young donkey and started down the Mount of Olives toward the city, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9. The crowd received him like a king, waving palm branches and shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." The next day, Jesus entered the temple, and when he saw the marketplace they had made of his Father's house, he was filled with anger. The court of the Gentiles, the only place where non-Jews could pray, had been turned into a noisy, corrupt marketplace. He braided a whip from cords and unleashed chaos. He overturned the money changers' tables, freed the animals, and drove out the changers and merchants, shouting, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of thieves." The final act had begun. The merchants fled while the religious leaders watched from the shadows. The tension in Jerusalem could be cut with a knife. The religious leaders were desperate to stop Jesus, but they had a serious problem. The crowd adored him. How could they do it without provoking a riot? Their chance came from where they least expected. On a dark night, Judas Iscariot knocked at their door. He was one of the 12, the treasurer who managed the group's money. The Bible says that Satan entered Judas and he made them an offer. He would hand over his teacher for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave. The priests accepted at once. The plan was in motion. The next day, Jesus gathered his disciples. He knew what was coming. They were going to celebrate Passover, but this meal would be the last. During the meal, Jesus dropped a bombshell. "Truly, I tell you, one of you will betray me." A murmur rippled around the table. Then Jesus dipped the bread and handed it to Judas. "What you're about to do quickly." Judas's heart pounded in his chest. He stood without a word and stepped out into the darkness. The traitor had been revealed. The others didn't understand what had just happened. Then Jesus took the bread. He broke it and said, "This is my body." Then he took the cup of wine. "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." The disciples drank, not realizing they were witnessing the birth of a sacrament that would still be celebrated 2,000 years later. And just when they thought the night couldn't get any more intense, Jesus did the unexpected. He took off his cloak and, one by one, began to wash their feet. Only Gentile slaves would do this. The master knelt like a servant, showing that leadership in his kingdom is rooted in humility and serving others. After supper, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Jesus did not change the plan. Judas knew that once the meal was over, Jesus would head to a garden called Gethsemane, just outside Jerusalem's walls, where he often prayed late into the night. In fact, that olive grove still exists today. Some of its trees are more than 2,000 years old. They could be the very ones under which Jesus prayed that night. Jesus knelt to pray, but his anguish was so deep that something unexplainable happened. The Bible says his sweat became great drops of blood falling to the ground. This isn't just a metaphor. It's a real and extremely rare medical condition called hematidrosis, in which extreme stress can cause the skin's capillaries to rupture so that blood mixes with sweat. Jesus knew the physical and spiritual agony that awaited him. Even so, his prayer was one of complete surrender. "Father, not my will, but yours." Suddenly the silence shattered. Torches, swords, the clamor of a crowd. Judas had arrived with the temple guards to arrest him. A kiss on the cheek was the signal. The kiss of betrayal. Peter drew his sword and sliced off the ear of the high priest's servant. But Jesus reached out, touched the man's ear, healed it on the spot and said, "Those who live by the sword die by the sword." Then the unthinkable happened. Seeing Jesus arrested, every one of his disciples fled. All of them. The same men who hours earlier had sworn to defend him to the death abandoned him. Why? What changed in an instant for their loyalty to vanish? It will all make more sense in a moment. But first, you need to see what happens to Jesus next. The soldiers dragged Jesus through the darkness toward the upper city. It was an exclusive neighborhood where the rich and powerful lived. There, in a lavish mansion, Annas, the former high priest, was waiting. The Jewish priests ruled their people like monarchs, but they had no authority to execute anyone. They needed help from someone else. From whom? That question would shape the next few hours. Jewish law forbade trials at night. It forbade judging cases during Passover. It forbade executions on the very day of the verdict. That night, the religious leaders broke every one of their own rules. Annas questioned Jesus. "Where are your followers? What is it you teach?" What Annas didn't know was that two of his closest disciples, Peter and John, were right there, hidden among the crowd, watching in silence. Jesus answered calmly, "I have spoken openly. Ask those who heard me in the temple." For that answer, a guard slapped him. It was the first blow of many, but the worst was yet to come. Jesus was about to say something that would seal his fate and turn almost everyone against him. But before Jesus spoke those fateful words, something terrible was unfolding outside, in the courtyard. While they were interrogating Jesus, Peter waited in the courtyard. A servant girl stared him down. "You were with Jesus." "I don't know him," Peter lied. Twice more he was recognized. Twice more he denied his master. Then the rooster crowed. At that moment, Jesus, beaten and bleeding, crossed the courtyard. His eyes met Peter's. Christ had foretold it exactly. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter ran off, weeping bitterly. Midnight was drawing near. Now they brought Jesus before Caiaphas, the high priest. Caiaphas had been plotting this night for a long time. He looked at Jesus and demanded, "Are you the Christ, the Son of God?" And Jesus answered, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power." Jesus wasn't ad-libbing. He was quoting the prophecy of Daniel 7, written 500 years earlier. By taking that text as his own, Jesus wasn't merely claiming to be the Messiah, he had just proclaimed himself to be God. The verdict was immediate, guilty of blasphemy. They now had their pretext to be rid of him. But there was a problem. The Jewish leaders couldn't execute him. Judea was under Rome's rule, and only Roman authority could hand down a death sentence. They needed Pontius Pilate. The sun was coming up. Jesus faced a third trial, this time formal, before the full Jewish council. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Judas ran toward the temple. It seemed Satan's influence had left him, because an unbearable guilt was crushing him. He went before the priests, threw down the 30 pieces of silver and shouted, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." But his confession changed nothing. He left the temple, probably through these gates, and made his way to a nearby valley. the Valley of Hinnom. And this is where everything connects. This valley, Gehenna, the very one we mentioned at the start, is the cursed place that gave hell its name, a place of wickedness and pagan sacrifice, and it was there that Judas, consumed by guilt, chose to end his life. Caiaphas took Jesus to Herod the Great's palace, from which Pontius Pilate now governed. The Jewish leaders brought Jesus to the palace gates, but did not go in. They didn't want to be defiled right before Passover, and the palace was filled with statues of Roman gods. So where did the trial take place? The answer lay hidden underground for centuries, until archaeologists found the foundations of a raised platform. Pilate would come out of the palace and sit on his judgment seat on this elevated platform. This was already Jesus' fourth trial in less than a day, and his enemies didn't want a quick death. They wanted the most torturous end the empire knew: crucifixion, reserved only for rebellious slaves and enemies of the state. But Pilate hesitated. History tells us he questioned Jesus several times, going in and out of the palace. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked point blank. And Jesus replied, "My kingdom is not of this world." With those words, Pilate saw no threat to Rome. He went out and declared Jesus innocent. The crowd erupted in fury. Pilate was baffled. What had this man done to provoke such hatred? But then, in the midst of the chaos, Pilate discovered a crucial detail. Jesus was from Galilee, and Galilee was under the jurisdiction of another ruler, Herod Antipas. And by an incredible historical coincidence, Herod happened to be in Jerusalem for Passover. Pilate saw an opportunity to hand the problem off and sent Jesus to Herod's vacation palace. Unlike Pilate, Herod was excited. He had heard about Jesus' miracles and wanted a show. He asked Jesus to do one of his tricks, but Jesus didn't say a single word. By then he had already been beaten and spat on by the temple guards. Now Herod's soldiers wanted their turn. They draped a royal robe over his bloodied back to mock his supposed royalty. Herod laughed, declared him innocent as well, and, as if he were a parcel, sent him back to Pilate. But when Jesus returned, the situation had grown worse. The sun was already high, and the crowd had swelled exponentially. This is where the story takes a terrible turn. But you may be wondering, why was this same crowd, which had hailed him days earlier, now calling for his death? These very Jews had welcomed Jesus as king just 5 days earlier. They believed Jesus would overthrow Rome. They wanted a warrior, a political liberator. But now they saw him chained, spat on and beaten. They saw him as a fraud. Their warrior Messiah was a weak, helpless prisoner. Disillusion turned to rage, and they kept shouting, "Crucify him!" Pilate, desperate, tried one last deal. He would hand Jesus over to his soldiers to be flogged, a brutal punishment that might satisfy the crowd. A flogging was no simple whipping. The soldiers used a whip with multiple leather straps, and at the ends of those straps they tied sharp shards of bone and small metal balls. It was torture designed to flay a man alive. Many did not survive the flogging, and for Jesus, this was only the beginning. The Roman soldiers took pleasure in torturing him. It was their entertainment. They wove a crown of thorns and drove it onto his head as they mocked him. When they brought him out before Pilate and the crowd, Jesus was unrecognizable. Even then, the crowd was not satisfied. They shouted again and again, "Crucify him!" But then Pilate tried one last move. It was Passover, and tradition required the release of a prisoner. "Which one do you want me to release to you?" he asked. "Jesus, or Jesus Barabbas?" Yes, you heard that right. Barabbas's name was also Jesus. That detail, so often lost in the retelling, is one of the Bible's most chilling ironies. Pilate was literally asking, "Which Jesus do you want, the murderer or the Savior?" They chose the murderer. And not only that, they shouted one of the most tragic lines in history, sealing their decision, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Pilate gave in. He washed his hands and handed him over to be crucified. Jesus was only hours from his last breath. The soldiers dragged him out of the praetorium. They loaded the cross's horizontal beam onto his shoulders. Rough, heavy, already stained with the blood of other condemned men. Every step was agony. Jesus made his way from the Praetorium to Golgotha, through the heart of Jerusalem's old city. That path of barely 600 meters is now one of the holiest places on earth, the way of the cross, the Via Dolorosa. But on that day, it was just an ordinary street turned into a corridor of death. Jesus was so weakened by the scourging that his body gave out on the way. He fell to the ground, the weight of the crossbeam pinning him to the dust. At last he reached the final destination, a rocky hill outside the city walls called Golgotha. There they stripped him before everyone. His body was a map of pain, and as they exposed him, the soldiers divided up his clothes, unknowingly fulfilling a prophecy written hundreds of years earlier. Then the moment came. At 9 in the morning they nailed him to a cross. Beside him, 2 other criminals suffered the same fate. One hurled insults at him. The other, however, did something no one expected. He admitted his guilt, and he acknowledged Jesus' innocence. Most people assume that someone on a cross died from the pain or from bleeding out through the nails, but the truth is far more terrible. The real cause of death was asphyxiation, a slow, excruciating struggle for every breath, and grasping that is the key to understanding what truly happened that day. Roman crucifixion was a public warning, engineered to inflict maximum agony for as long as possible. To draw even a single breath, Jesus had to push his whole body upward, using his feet as a lever, again and again, for hours. Meanwhile, the crowd mocked. Mary and John, the beloved disciple, wept together. He was the only disciple who stayed through the worst of it. Then something unexplainable happened. From noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness fell over the land. In broad daylight, the sky grew heavy, dense. It was as if all creation held its breath. The Lamb was bearing the weight of the world's sin. And in that eerie gloom, Jesus breathed his final words. "It is finished." That was his mission. No one took his life from him. He gave it. He willingly suffered for every wrong you and I have ever done. In that moment, the earth responded. An earthquake split the temple in Jerusalem in 2. The symbolic barrier between God and humanity was shattered. Access to the Father would no longer be limited. But Jesus didn't just defeat death on the cross, he conquered it by rising 3 days later. Because the cross wasn't the final destination. It was the door, the beginning of something extraordinary. To understand how he overcame death, we must trace his steps. For 40 days, Jesus appeared in different places on the map, in Jerusalem, in Galilee, on the road to Emmaus. More than 500 people saw him, and many of these witnesses died for proclaiming what they saw. After Jesus' death, the disciples hid in Jerusalem. The religious leaders had sealed Jesus' tomb and posted Roman guards. 3 days later, at dawn on Sunday, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb with several other women. Then the impossible happened. The 2-ton stone had been rolled away. The tomb was empty. Jesus' body was gone. In the midst of the confusion, Mary Magdalene sank down, sobbing uncontrollably. A man drew near, but her tear-blurred eyes kept her from recognizing him, until the man spoke her name, Mary. Mary looked up and recognized him. It was him. In that instant, everything changed. Jesus was alive. She moved to draw close, to embrace him, to cling to him. But Jesus lifted his hand gently and said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary understood this was not a reunion to linger in. It was a mission. Without a moment to lose, she ran back to the upper room where the disciples were hiding. The other women who were with her saw the same and ran back to the city. But on the way, Jesus suddenly appeared, and he greeted them with a simple, "Greetings." They wrapped their arms around him. He was real, flesh and blood. Jesus was alive, and he said, "Do not be afraid, go tell my brothers." The women raced off, thrilled, to share the great news with the disciples, but the disciples didn't believe them. In those days, a woman's testimony counted for nothing. It wasn't even admitted in a Jewish court, no matter how many women spoke. Jesus chose a group of women, the very ones the world rejected, to announce the most important event in history. Everyone had lost faith, except Peter and John, who ran to the tomb with a spark of hope. And when they arrived, the tomb was empty. Jesus wasn't there. They found only the burial linens, perfectly arranged, as if the body had vanished from within them. The cloth that had been around his head was folded up separately, set in another place. A strange detail John never forgot. But not all the disciples were in Jerusalem waiting for word. 2 of them, hearts sunk, had lost all hope. They were walking to their village, Emmaus, about 7 miles away. For them, it was over. On the road, a stranger fell in step with them and began sketching a map through the scriptures. From Moses to the last of the prophets, he showed how everything pointed to a Messiah who had to suffer to enter his glory. Like Mary, they didn't recognize him either. They walked and talked with him for hours. It wasn't until they sat down to supper in Emmaus, when Jesus took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, that their eyes were opened. It was him, and in that very moment, he vanished. The shock was so great that they turned right around. They ran the 7 miles back to Jerusalem in the middle of the night to tell the others. And as they told the rest of the disciples their incredible story, Jesus himself appeared right in the middle of the room. This was his 3rd appearance. He didn't open the door, he simply appeared, and his greeting was the same: "Peace be with you." But they didn't feel joy, they felt terror. They thought they were seeing a ghost. Even with him standing right in front of them, doubt proved stronger. It wasn't until he showed them the wounds in his hands and feet and ate a piece of broiled fish in front of them that they began to believe. Even so, one was missing. Thomas wasn't there that night, and when they told him, he refused to believe. A week later, Jesus appeared for the 4th time with a clear purpose. He went straight to Thomas and said, "Put your finger here, look at my hands, reach out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." Thomas didn't need to touch him. He fell to his knees and cried out one of the greatest declarations of faith in all the Bible: "My Lord and my God." Up to now, every appearance of Jesus seemed meant to conquer doubt and to prove that he had truly risen. But the last 3 appearances were different. They took place far from the tension of Jerusalem, out in the calm of Galilee. 8 days later, the disciples had gone back home, back to what they knew: fishing. They were in their boat, discouraged, when a man shouted to them from the shore. It was Jesus. There by the sea, Jesus looked at Peter and asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" 3 times Peter answered that he did. Then Jesus told him what lay ahead. "When you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Peter didn't understand it in that moment, but Jesus had just foretold his death. Peter and all the disciples would die in horrific ways, crucified, stoned, burned alive, only for saying that Jesus had risen from the dead. Believing that someone rose from the dead is hard for many to accept. Jesus knew that, and so he orchestrated his final 2 appearances accordingly. Jesus told the disciples to meet him on a mountain near the Sea of Galilee, and there something extraordinary happened. Not only did the 11 disciples appear, but so did 500 of his followers. All at once, we weren't talking about 11 witnesses anymore. We were talking about 500 people who said they'd seen the risen Jesus. That's why Christianity exploded and became the fastest growing faith in history. And then came the final appearance. They gathered on the Mount of Olives just outside Jerusalem. There, with their own eyes, they watched Jesus ascend to heaven until a cloud hid him from view. In that final moment, Jesus didn't give them a physical proof, but a promise, one that would become the most powerful evidence of all. He promised that God's Spirit would come upon them, and that this Spirit would draw people to him throughout history. 50 days later, 3,000 people came to faith in a single day. Within a few years, the message spread across the entire Roman Empire. And that's how the most important week in history ended. 7 days that looked like the most painful defeat, and in reality, turned out to be the most complete victory. Jesus didn't avoid death, he passed through it, and in doing so, He broke its hold from within. Darkness became light. God's plan was fulfilled. Death was defeated. Sin was overcome. The work of salvation was, at last, complete. If this message moved you, if at any point you felt something ignite inside, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, because sometimes a single reflection written with honesty can become the answer someone needed in their darkest night. Leave your comment. Let's thank God for giving us His greatest gift, the eternal life we share with Him. And if you believe that love is still the force that truly transforms the world, hit the like button. It's a way to send this message further, so that everyone knows what happened in the most important week in human history. But this week holds many more secrets. There's a story almost no one stops to notice. The one who stood closest to that moment wasn't a disciple. He was the executioner, a Roman soldier who was losing his sight, caught in that supernatural darkness, saw something that sent him to his knees and made him the first Gentile to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. What did Longinus really see? What happened to the soldier tasked with making sure Jesus died on the cross? You've got to watch the video on your screen, because it's one of the most astonishing and least told transformations in all of history. And pay close attention, because the spear that pierced Jesus' side on the cross became the most coveted relic in history. Don't miss this Holy Week secret, a story told for centuries as one of the most powerful transformations ever witnessed. Blessings to you and your family.